Oh, hey guys. I guess I'm opening this one up. What's up? I'm Ana Kasparian, for those of you who are familiar with Ryan's work but don't know who I am, because sometimes that happens.
No. Not on TYT, I don't think.
I love coming to DC specifically for these conversations with Ryan. As you guys know, he does incredible reporting. And the reason why I'm in DC is Bernie Sanders is doing another one of his fantastic town halls. This time around, he really wants to shine light on income inequality in America. How do we combat it? Why is income inequality such a huge problem in the richest country in the world?
One thing that will be a backdrop to this conversation, and I wonder if Michael Moore might be the kind that kind of has the, effort to just bring it up. It would be, and TYT viewers probably, who have been following the bank deregulation bill have noticed that Elizabeth Warren has been making a lot of enemies on the Democratic side by calling her colleagues out by name, saying this person are all they're all selling out the party in the country by joining with Trump and the Republicans to deregulate these big banks under the guise of a community bank bill. And interestingly, Sanders has not been doing that.
Right.
Sanders is the one who's always caricatured as he's not a Democrat. Get him out of the party. Why do you even let him run? He's a complete monster. But in fact, he's been much more of a team player on this. He will say, if you ask him, that the bank bill is bad and that it's unnecessary rollback and we ought to tighten regulations of the bank, ought to break up the big banks. Everybody knows Bernie Sanders would break up the big banks. But he doesn't go any further than that. He's not calling out his colleagues, despite the reputation that he has, whereas Elizabeth Warren very much has been naming names and creating enemies as a result.
Yeah, I to be quite honest with you, I would be shocked if that specific question comes up. But real quick, to Bernie's credit, that was something that I asked him about in an interview prior to this town hall. And the news broke that day that the Senate had passed that deregulation bill. And 16 Democrats voted in favor of deregulating banks that are, raking in $250 billion. Okay, so if you're worth $250 billion, you're not a community bank. And so this deregulation could have some serious ramifications to our economy. So I asked him,
he
didn't call them out by name,
right.
But it kind of started with, hey, here's what these Democrats are doing. What do you think? And he gave me a very diplomatic answer. But then I went on a little bit of a rant about how, these Democrats, they just don't get it. They're not winning. They're not favored by real progressives such as myself. And that's one of the reasons why Hillary lost. And if anything, they need to learn a lesson. And then he went off as well. So I think, of course, his heart is in the right place. But it is interesting to see Elizabeth Warren take a more aggressive stance in naming names and making some of those political enemies, which I love.
I wonder if he's scarred a little bit from, because the caricature of his campaign is that it was vicious, it was mudslinging, it was attacking Hillary's character, and
his campaign was
right.
Vicious,
But if you ask Clinton supporters and mainstream Democrats about the campaign, that's their line on it, that he called her a liar, he called her a sellout, he called her corrupt. Why couldn't he just stick to the issues?
Right.
But in fact, he didn't even actually call her those things. What he said was she took money from Goldman Sachs.
Exactly.
And on and on. He's and just the fact that he mentioned where her campaign financing was coming from, they feel was some huge betrayal of the party. And he didn't do a burn it all down. He then endorsed her. He then went on the campaign trail for her. But it didn't stop the criticism, and so I think he's a little bit bitten, and I think that he's a little shy as a result of that. And then on the flip side, Warren, assuming that Clinton was going to win the nomination and that she wanted to maintain some ability to influence her, never endorsed Bernie.
You're right.
And nobody has forgiven her for that. And so I think it helps her politically with the left to be calling out her Democrats. So in a way, maybe both of their activities in the last few weeks are kind of influenced by the campaign and their reaction to the campaign.
I think that your analysis is largely correct. We can only speculate as to why Bernie has kind of changed his strategy. But what I do know is if Elizabeth Warren is planning on running in 2020, something that she will neither confirm nor deny, I think that it's a smart strategy to differentiate herself from other potential political candidates by being as aggressive as she is, especially on the issue of deregulation and these big banks. It's what she was already known for,
Right.
but I think she's really solidifying her position. The refreshing thing is that we have two senators who do want to address an important issue like income inequality in America. And, income inequality is affecting everyone regardless of your demographic. And we know that it certainly impacts certain communities like the Black community or the Hispanic community more, but it doesn't matter who you are. There are a lot of white Americans in the middle of the country who ended up voting for Trump because he was the only candidate in the general election, this is after the primaries, who kept talking about economic issues over and over again, jobs over and over again.
And one of the things in this bill, and we talked about this last week, the most grotesque provision to me, because it's just so petty and nasty, is that there's a giveaway to a Warren Buffett owned company that basically makes loans to people that live in trailer parks so that they can buy trailer homes, and it will gut the regulations around that, and so it would allow you to kind of like feed people into these like shady brokers and these shady lenders who are going to then rip off the people who are already in a situation in their lives where the best they can do is buy a mobile home, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
It's a vulnerable population that's being exploited, and it's disgusting. And so, again, the only role of the government, and this is a common philosophical debate, but I think most people can agree, the only role of the government should be to protect people, right? And that includes protecting consumers, ensuring that predatory behavior isn't happening with these big banks and these lenders. And so, it's pretty disgusting to see that happening, especially toward a community that's already vulnerable.
Yeah, they went after, in the CFPB, they carved out auto dealers. And so as a result, all of these shady loans are being made to, to come along with these from these used car dealers. So you've got used car dealers, and you've got mobile home operators and mobile home lenders. It's like designed to say, how can we pick out the most vulnerable people and squeeze every last drop out of them? That's the other thing. Well, how much are you really going to squeeze out of them? Well, enough that they'll squeeze it.
Yeah, and what's crazy is that on the Democratic side, at least in the Senate, there's only a couple Democratic senators who actually care to fight for the people, for the middle class and the working class. And that didn't always used to be the case. There used to be this sense that Democrats would look out for the little guy, and that, the Republicans were the greedier, party that wanted to, hoard their wealth and not pay their taxes. But I feel like the messaging has changed by establishment Democrats especially, and it's going to continue hurting them in upcoming elections if they realize that, hey, taking care of my donors is more important than taking care of the American people. Yeah.
And we were talking earlier about this New York Times piece that kind of reflects on all that. You want to talk about that one?
Sure. So the New York Times just published the results of a study that was done by researchers at Harvard and Stanford. And they wanted to do a comparative analysis of Black and white boys who grew up in tremendously wealthy families, and they wanted to track them and see what happens later in life. And it's much more likely that a Black boy who's raised in the top 1% will actually end up incarcerated versus a white boy who's raised in the top 1%. They're not only more likely to be incarcerated, they're also more likely to lose their financial status.
Yeah.
And I just thought that, we talk about income inequality because it affects all of us regardless of what demographic we're in. But it's, certainly more prevalent and more severe in vulnerable communities. And it's crazy because when it comes to income inequality, there are all sorts of arguments made by those on the right. Oh, it's because this person didn't work hard enough, or there are inherent differences among the races, right? Or there are differences in the culture. But this comparative analysis factored in all of those issues to ensure that, they're comparing apples to apples. And you still see a significant decrease in wealth when it comes to black men, black boys.
And they're trying to compare apples to apples. I haven't looked into this study too closely, but I'm curious because I bet one thing that it's finding is not just the embedded structural racism in the country, but what that embedded racism has created, which are the legacy effects of wealth. In other words, there aren't a lot of black families in this country that can go back 4, 6, 10 generations of wealth. And so if a black family made it into this top 1% in order to make it into this study, more likely it was because the parents were like some extraordinary success rather than, they've just had money forever.
Right.
And having money forever has a buffering effect for a family, because if one thing goes wrong for one member of the family, you have all these other people that are doing well. And you can see that in the way that so many of these families have so many screw-ups, yet they maintain an extraordinary amount of wealth. And I've thought about this recently as I grew up really poor, and I've always thought of that as like, well, look at me, I overcame that, etc. I should be so proud of myself. But part of it was that, and I grew up raised by a single mom. But my father was also in my life. He was very well educated. My mother was very well educated, and both of them, went to college, and they came from parents who were well educated, and so my mom had a run of very bad luck, and an entire generation can have a run of bad luck. But the legacy of the wealth and the education from before still filtered down, and so even though all the people I was hanging out with, were total screw-ups and also poor, I always thought to myself, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to be okay. And that's not the kind of environment you have if you don't have those legacy effects of wealth being passed down, and that wouldn't. It's very unlikely that would have been the case if I were black. It's because I'm white that it was more likely that people in my distant past had some money and some education.
Yeah, that's a fascinating perspective. And, another example, and I think a much more extreme example, would be our own president. I mean, in what world are you able to go bankrupt
Yes.
6 times and you're still
This
considered
world.
super
Right.
wealthy?
Yeah.
So there are different.
And his screw-up kids, who obviously are the least talented people you've ever come across, and they managed to run businesses.
I know.
And fell large animals.
Yeah.